Thank you, Tamsin, for your generous introduction. I'm honored to be giving the sesquicentennial baccalaureate address. There, I've said it, and as long as I did not ask to spell it, I'll be okay. I'm not sure my successor in 25 years will have it much easier. That will be Swarthmore's Dobrin Centennial. I can't spell that either. I hope many of you return for the Dobrin Centennial and many reunions in between. Swarthmore will always be glad to have you back, and your old professors delighted to see you. Today is a dry run for tomorrow, when President Chop will bestow on you your hard-earned and well-deserved degrees, and your parents will breathe a deep and wallet-expanding sigh of relief. This rite of passage marks your entry into what is euphemistically called the real world. I think that at least initially, however, you'll find it much more of a surreal world, where things and experiences are not associated with their attributes, but with the illogical and preposterous. Astrology praised, astronomy scorned, shoddy arguments carrying the day, income unconnected to contribution, value confused with price, and the obvious made obscure. At first, your education at Swarthmore will ill-equip you to negotiate this surreal world. But as your eyes adjust to the distorted landscape and you can bring to bear what you've learned, with a little luck and enormous effort, you'll succeed in making at least some of Salvador Dali's limp watches tell time. Swarthmore's sesquicentennial class. What a mouthful. It might put things in a bit of perspective if we cast our minds back to that other class of 14, namely the class that graduated a century ago in 1914. That class graduated in June to find the world at war just 2 months later. While many predicted that the war was coming, few thought that it would last so long or kill so many. When we think of that dreadful war, which left 16 million people dead, we often forget that during and just after that war, in 1918 and 19, an influenza epidemic killed over 50 million people worldwide. In the United States alone, it's estimated that 500 to 600,000 people died. One day alone in October 1918, over 500 Philadelphians died from the flu. No one in the class of 14 could have predicted that epidemic, nor the soul-destroying catastrophe of the Great Depression, nor the devastating Second World War, which concluded with the incineration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. May you, the sesquicentennial class, live in less interesting times, but don't count on it. Still, despite these traumas, members of the class of 1914 would have been aware of and actively taken part in one of the great social and political movements of their time, the enfranchisement of women. One of its leaders was a typical Swathi, Alice Paul. After graduating in 1905 with a degree in biology, she went on to earn a master's degree in sociology, a PhD in economics, and then, for good measure, a degree in law. As I say, a typical Swathi. With her efforts and the efforts of the class of 14 and many classes before and after, the right of women to vote in every state was finally recognized in 1920. Alice Paul and the members of that class of 1914 fought for equal rights throughout their lives. And when that class met for its 50th reunion in 1964, they could take pride in knowing that because of their efforts, and of course the efforts of tens of thousands of fellow citizens, civil rights were extended more broadly. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is only one success. They would, however, have had to wait until 3 years after their 50th reunion for the Supreme Court to declare that laws prohibiting interracial marriage were unconstitutional throughout the land. So despite 2 world wars, a pandemic, a deep depression, the assassination of a president, and much more, the class of 14, that other class, had much of which to be proud. They helped rebuild the nation after the devastation of the Depression and the Second World War. and helped to rid us of de jure segregation, if not de facto racism. And they left us with a functioning democracy. And what of you, Swarthmore's sesquicentennial class? Some challenges facing the country and indeed the world are easy to see if difficult to solve. Others are impossible to see in advance and are what were once described as unknown unknowns. There's little point in speculating about what these might be any more than the class of 1914 could have predicted the influenza epidemic or atomic weapons. But there are known knowns among our future challenges. One looming known is global climate change. Only motivated reasoning can lead one to deny its reality or the magnitude of the challenges that lie ahead. For some, global climate change is what we might call a suppressed known, something we convince ourselves isn't known, though it is. One can deny the reality of climate change only by scorning the science underlying it. And to do that, since the science is so well established, science must be dismissed more generally with predictable and destructible results. This catastrophic suppressed knowledge is largely motivated by desire not to make any significant sacrifices by anyone, especially those who benefit financially from the status quo. And of course, all of us do. So you have a monumental challenge that you have little alternative but to face. How to do it? You'll need the best science, the smartest public policy, and deep moral reflection to confront this terrible menace. Your education at Swarthmore will, I think, have equipped you better than most to meet this challenge. Oh, and read the biographies of Lucretia Mott and Alice Paul. They will provide inspiration as well as strategic and tactical suggestions. Not all the tactical suggestions will be approved by some members of the Swarthmore faculty board, however. Study the lives of Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela, too. All will illustrate the enviable but extraordinarily difficult virtue of perseverance in the face of disappointment, but sustained by an abiding faith in the justice and necessity of their cause. Another suppressed known is a serious consequence of wealth maldistribution. It isn't the inequality as such that matters so much, though that isn't unimportant, but the disproportionate power belonging to a tiny sliver of societies. Thomas Piketty has acutely and convincingly diagnosed the problem in his Capital in the 21st Century. It'll be your task to think through yourselves to solutions that are both just and effective. But today I want to talk to you about two things that I believe need urgent thought and action as well. Two things that are not unconnected with the challenges of climate change and wealth maldistribution. The urgent need to increase tolerance and the need to reinvigorate our democracy, at least to the level of democracy it had when that other class of 14 met for its 50th reunion. I'll speak mostly of tolerance, though Tamsin has stolen my thunder, and talk about its necessity, its limits, and why it's fundamental to a well-ordered liberal society. I believe that we as individuals and communities are growing increasingly intolerant of those with contrary and disagreeable beliefs, attitudes, and ways of being. This intolerance is bad for us as individuals, it's certainly bad for us as communities, and it undermines our democracy. For we become increasingly shut off from one another and shut out those we too quickly dismiss as beyond the pale. We increasingly, I fear, choose to live in the echo chambers of our own intolerance. But what is tolerance and what's its good? It is first of all a virtue. And virtues are character traits that are not merely ways of feeling and believing, but suggest courses of action to be pursued in the right circumstances and for the right reasons from a fixed character. In addition to tolerance, which is a comparative latecomer in the constellation of virtues, we find humility, perseverance, generosity, justice, and courage. To be courageous, for example, doesn't mean that one must always stand one's ground. Sometimes it takes courage to retreat, to fight another day. To cut and run, however, is always cowardly, and that's not a virtue either. In general, virtues have this Goldilocks nature, not being too hot, not too cold, but just right. And tolerance is no exception. It takes reasoned deliberation and good judgment to get it right. Tolerance is an especially difficult virtue because it lies uneasily between suppression on the one hand and full acceptance on the other. As such, it moves in a kind of no man's land, a seemingly unstable position between two opposed poles. Minimally, tolerance means little more than was captured by a New Yorker cartoon showing a man carrying a sandwich board which read, "Put up with thy neighbor." In New York, at least, loving thy neighbor would seem out of the question. And it's true, tolerance and norms of toleration don't require love, but they do require a level of respect for those with whom we deeply disagree and whose actions we rightly deplore. I'll say more about this in a moment, but it must be remarked that many are either suspicious of or actually despise tolerance. Some think that it's the refuge of the timid, those afraid to assert and, if necessary, impose correct views on the world. Ogden Nash nicely expressed this in a limerick. "Sometimes a secret pride I sigh, to think how tolerant am I, then wonder which is really mine, tolerance or a rubber spine." Someone who certainly didn't possess a rubber spine was Father, later Bishop Bossuet. When the Edict of Nantes was revoked in 1685, Bishop Bossuet infamously said that Protestant clergymen had to convert or be executed. When Protestants complained about the persecution, he said, "Why do I have the right to persecute you? Because I'm right and you're wrong." So is tolerance simply the rationalization of the timid? Is it perhaps the refuge of those who simply don't care, those who give a world-weary, cynical sigh, or say with a sandwich board man, "Put up with thy neighbor"? Or is it something to be altogether despised, as in the case of Bishop Bossuet? Such conclusions would have us forget how hard won toleration was. The religious wars throughout Europe between Catholics and Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries had first one religion and then the other assuming the role of persecutor. It took many years, culminating but not originating in John Locke's letter concerning toleration and his treatise on government in 1690, both of which were inspiration to the founders of this republic, to help establish toleration as a political principle. Today, tolerance and toleration extend beyond Locke's purely religious concerns. But as a virtue, they provide norms of civil conduct and remain at the heart of a vibrant, liberal, democratic order. Tolerance is rightly to be despised, however, when one tolerates what should be simply accepted and tolerates what should be simply rejected. Jews, Muslims, and Palestinians, for example, should not be tolerated. They should be accepted. Their freedom to live as they see fit must be accepted, provided only that their freedom doesn't come at the expense of others. Racism and sexism, on the other hand, should not be tolerated, but adamantly and decisively repudiated. Even these obvious examples make the point that we must think through what are and what are not appropriate objects of toleration. Tolerance is despicable when we tolerate the intolerable or don't tolerate the tolerable. The need for tolerance arises when some person, community, or institution has power over others and is sorely tempted to use it to the detriment of the objects of toleration. The temptation lies when there's deep disagreement and deep disapproval of the weaker party. This was true in Tudor England, for example, when captured Catholic priests were drawn and quartered. In France, the Catholics returned the compliment by executing Protestant Huguenots. So tolerance is especially needed when one has power to oppress another and is tempted to use it. We might think, thankfully, tolerance doesn't apply to us because we are comparatively powerless, and you, believe me, have almost no power, right? But first of all of us have power over others sometimes, even if it's your kid brother, right? So all of us need to cultivate the virtue of tolerance and develop ways of living that express the virtue, that is, to act tolerantly. As must be emphasized again, tolerance always has limits. Obviously, we shouldn't tolerate what itself is actively intolerant, nor should we tolerate that which is intolerable. Sexual assault being a pointed example that is clearly intolerable. In many ways, then, intolerance is the dog and tolerance is the tail. That is to say, we first make the judgment that something is within the realm of tolerance, and then we act through that. A theory of tolerance can only provide a general framework. Each attitude, norm, and way of life must be taken on its own merits. At the same time, coming to such deliberations with an attitude of tolerance is likely to make an enormous difference. An intolerant person is more likely than an intolerant person is more likely than a tolerant person to conclude straight away that those with whom they have deep disagreements have nothing to contribute, that we're fully justified in laughing at them, scorning them, and in general, trying to place them beyond the pale to make them, as much as we can, non-persons. Now, suppose there is something of which you disapprove, and deeply disapprove, yet think that it is tolerable. What then? Well, there are a range of policies, from the sandwich board man's, put up with thy neighbor. That's kind of passive form of tolerance. Even could say a grudging tolerance through gritted teeth and clenched fists. But as Tamsin has suggested, I think there is a more active notion of tolerance, one where we engage with those whose thoughts and actions we disapprove. From within a robust liberal standpoint, where liberal does not mean left, wing, or Democrat, but someone who thinks liberty or freedom means more than simply doing your own thing for whatever reason, or no reason at all. The liberal justification of tolerance is one especially suited to our own pluralistic, multicultural society, riven as it is by deep political and moral disagreements. It's called for when we have grounds for disapproval, yet think there are counterbalancing reasons that should lead us to tolerate what we find wanting morally, religious, culturally, or politically. Why? I think there are two fundamental reasons. The first is that although we may be confident in our own reasons for favoring what we do and finding deficient in what we disapprove, when we are honest with ourselves, when we're alone with ourselves, we must acknowledge that our reasons are often neither conclusive nor such that only the exceptionally dim-witted or malevolent could possibly disagree with us. In other words, tolerance calls for certain humility, another virtue. The second reason we should cultivate the virtue of tolerance, I believe, is that we justly treasure autonomy. Where autonomy is the view that each of us is the part author of our own lives. Part author because, unlike novelists such as Tolkien, we don't have the freedom to create whole worlds. Much, if not most of our world is simply given. But within this given world, tolerant people believe that all should be able to follow their own lights as they strive to live a worthwhile life as they, not we, judge. Within a worthwhile life, including our own, there are often elements that are not worthwhile, but worthless or deplorable or shameful, yet not so bad as to lead us to intervene and force change to make it as pure as we might wish. Why the caution? Why not extirpate what we deplore in an otherwise worthwhile way of life? To try to do so frequently falls afoul of what I call the sweater principle. Sometimes one has a sweater that keeps one warm and is passably fashionable, except for one annoying strand of wool. We think that if we just pull this thread, our sweater would be much improved, and it could be. On the other hand, we might end up with a tangle of yarn at our feet. So to know whether to try to excise the objectionable isn't easy. We should be exceptionally cautious when our familiarity with a way of life or system of belief is cursory, when we don't know it from the inside. This was the oft-made mistake of Christian missionaries in past centuries. Bernard Williams, a philosopher, said that when the Christian missionaries came across polygamy in some countries, all they could think of was a seedy bigamist from Birmingham, England. So they didn't understand it from the inside. If we think about this at the social level and not just at the interpersonal level, it would help lower the venomous nature of our present public life and discourse. And that would also greatly bolster our attenuated democracy. Let me give you an example of what I have in mind. About 20 years ago, two women of a certain age attended pro- and anti-abortion rallies on opposite sides of the street. They often saw each other at the barricades and noticed that their counterpart was not on the front lines, but rather hung back a bit, offering tea and coffee, but not screaming and holding signs that accused the opposing protesters of wishing to murder either women or babies. One woman approached the other after one such rally and suggested they have coffee. They found that they had much in common: children, grandchildren, hardships, and heartbreak, and so on. So they formed a group that tried to find a way out of the hatred, the contempt, and the vilification. Did they change their own minds about the morality of abortion? No, nor did they try. That wasn't the point. But they resolved not to demonize those with whom they deeply disagreed, and to try to think of ways to arrive at principled accommodation of their diametrically opposed views. Were they successful? Only to a degree. But then we are seldom 100% successful in resolving deep controversies. Their efforts showed, however, the respect they had for one another, for others who find themselves somewhere in the middle. They respected one another as women, as mothers, as grandmothers, as women of faith, as persons, and as fellow citizens. So while each saw what they regarded as errors in the views of the other, they nevertheless thought that each other was within the realm of the tolerable, and they should try to engage with each other to find some way out of the terrible impasse without suppression or demonization. And this brings me to democracy and the profound idea of citizen. Although there isn't anything in it anymore, it's useful to remind ourselves that the people of Great Britain were not originally citizens, but subjects of the king or queen. As I say, the notion hasn't amounted to much in Great Britain for a long time, but it once had real import, an import that the founders of our republic knew and rejected. The meaning of what it is to be a citizen should be taken seriously, and never more so than now. For too often, one doesn't hear the word citizen, but when politicians and pundits take as a substitute, namely taxpayer. So the question is not what the citizens want, but what about the taxpayer? As citizens, we're all political equals, with equal rights and equal responsibilities. During the Putney debates of 1647, the leveler Thomas Rainsborough put the thought this way: "For really I think that the poorest he that in England hath a life to live as the greatest he." As taxpayers, we are clearly not equal. The poorest he's and she's don't have nearly as much wealth as the greatest he's and she's. And if what matters is not that one is a citizen, but that one pays taxes, then it's a small move to conclude that those who pay more total taxes should have a greater say than those who pay less in total taxes. Now, money is always talked in politics, and it would be foolish to think otherwise. But as in the dying days of the Roman Republic, money in American politics now shouts, and shouts at the top of its lungs. Some of the big money comes from the left, much comes from the right. But whether left or right, money corrupts democracy and corrupts absolutely. It does so in many ways, from which issues are discussable, which candidates have the financial backing to run for office, who can afford to sustain lawsuits, and in many other ways. Politics in a flourishing democracy will always be hardball, but it doesn't have to be beanball. We must recognize that everyone deplores the elevation of wealthy taxpayers over citizens. Let me give you an example. Recent sociological studies, I'm sorry to say, suggest that when the preferences of the wealthy and the preferences of the vast majority diverge, American politicians respond positively to the preferences of the rich minority and not to the far less wealthy majority. A libertarian economist at James Madison University, Brian Kaplan, said this about one of his studies. I find the author's results not only intellectually satisfying, but hopeful. If his results hold up, we know another important reason why policy is less statist than expected. Democracies listen to the relatively libertarian rich far more than they listen to the absolutely statist non-rich. My sincere reaction is to say, thank goodness. Democracy as we know it is bad enough. Democracy that really listened to all the people would be an authoritarian nightmare. This lack of trust in democracy accounts for so many of the efforts, I think, to suppress voter registration. Professor Kaplan is not alone in his disdain of democracy. Throughout the modern age, some dismiss democracy as the rule of the stupid. Even Winston Churchill was not immune. The best argument against democracy, he said, is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. But to his lasting credit, and in Parliament, he said this: many forms of governments have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms that have been tried from time to time. Democracies are especially vulnerable to being undermined from within. John Adams warned us 2 centuries ago that democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, he says, exhausts and murders itself. Adams concluded that there never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. Today, we need to be on the lookout more for the demise of democracy, not by its own hand, so to speak, but by the hands of those from within the very political order that provides them with their extraordinary wealth. You, I hope, are friends of democracy and will engage in the issues of the day by taking on the strongest opponents of democracy, and do so with reasoned arguments, not snarky put-downs, rage, or suppression. For the people who need convincing are not one's fellow true believers, nor ideologues of any stripe, but those whose minds are open to change, those with whom you may now disagree. Yes, I know, attack ads work, as do other forms of manipulation, such as innuendo. You, as liberal arts graduates from Swarthmore, are equipped to do battle against this corruption of democracy with integrity, honor, and reason. But beware. It's a perennial temptation for the excesses of one side to be mirrored by those of the other. So a dirty right hand mirrored becomes an equally dirty left hand. How does intolerance figure in this? In his 1929 autobiography, Mohandas Gandhi wrote, "Love the sinner but hate the sinner." Hate the sin. Love the sinner but hate the sin. I offer a clumsier, secularized version. Don't tolerate what's intolerable, but engage those with whom we profoundly disagree with respect and reasoned argument. We need to adhere to norms of toleration. When we find those with whom we deeply disagree, who but also manipulate and use underhanded tactics, the temptation is to fight fire with fire. I urge you to resist this temptation. It generally leads to a general conflagration that consumes everyone with destructive hatred. Or to put the point more graphically, if you choose to wrestle with a pig, you'll find yourself in the mud, but only the pig will be having a good time. Draw the conclusion that any of our fellow citizens with whom we vehemently disagree shouldn't be given a hearing or that should be denounced as actively silenced. As John Stuart Mill said nearly a sesquicentennial ago, confronting the arguments of opponents will either lead us to modify our own views if we discover that the truth isn't all on our own side, or deepen the grounds and commitments of our own views if it turns out that we're right. So it isn't intolerant to confront those with whom you deeply disagree with reasoned, respectful arguments, as well as political action. Indeed, reasoned argument is one form of political action. Stressing tolerance as not only what you and I as individuals owe to each other, but as what we owe to each other as citizens, means that we can engage with the great known issues of today, such as climate change, wealth maldistribution, and the great unknown issues of tomorrow with spirit and in good faith, but only if we maintain a robust democracy. None of this will be easy. The acquisition and practice of virtues are never easy, or they wouldn't be virtues. This is true whether the virtue in question is courage, self-control, or tolerance. But if we look back on the activists a century ago, Swarthmore activists a century ago, there's ample reason for hope. For with these virtues and more, your namesake class accomplished much with intense dedication, grace, good humor, and perseverance. At the same time, be assured that as you engage with the great public issues of the day, there will be ample time for you to pursue your own personal projects, whether they're academic, artistic, entrepreneurial, charitable, or any other. Ample time, too, to form families and to make new friends and to keep old ones. Next week, members of another class, the Centennial Class of 1964, will be hugging their friends of a lifetime. Friends made at Swarthmore, just as you've made friends at Swarthmore. In 50 years' time, during Swarthmore's bicentennial year, you will be doing the same, reflecting on the state of the world, greeting old friends, and boasting about your grandchildren. If I had a bit more time, I'd like to boast about mine. I wish for you, as I wish for every member of every graduating class in the nearly 50 years I've taught at Swarthmore, a life filled with accomplishment, with joy, to you, to your families and friends, and that you exercise a steady and energetic hand in bringing about a tolerant and more flourishing democracy. Thank you.